Hello, everyone. So happy to be here. So I skipped last year, VueConf US, and it's great to see how big it has become. It's also my first time in Austin as Evan, and in Texas, but I don't live in the US, so that's also easier for me. So that's my full name as well, written, because in the website it's not written completely, it's too long, or something else, I don't know. I'm a freelance, although I do not work as much as a freelance anymore because I managed to do more than 80% of my working hours doing Vue open source, which is great. You can find me online as Pozva, and even though now I'm working almost 80%, I think more, if you count my weekends as well when I want to work, because at the end I also want to work on Vue-Router on the weekends sometimes. I wasn't always working that much on open source, so I started more as a user, and I find myself also maintaining it. But the proportion wasn't always the same, right? But it did give me some insights, because at the same time I was using it to build stuff, I was also building libraries, so I was seeing bugs, and I was getting myself some feedback. It wasn't always the best, but it was there. And as a user, I know that the first week, it's very easy to start with, at least for Vue-Router. The fact is, even if you use Next, you won't even know that there is a router until they tell you. And it has happened so many times to me that I tell them, oh, it's the same router. There is not two different things. Like, oh, OK, I didn't know. But unfortunately, the reality doesn't stay true for very long. So I want to give you some insights about how does this happen? Why does it happen? So to do that, we want to go back and take a step back, look at why the Vue-Router is so easy to use, and what is wrong exactly. The Vue-Router, when you want to use it, you have this instance you create. You have an array of routes, and the routes are telling this path is going to correspond to a specific component. So for example, here we have search. We want to display the component search. We have path with movies ID, which is a dynamic parameter, and we want to display the details of a movie. Then we include this component router view somewhere, and the router will transform the URL into this object that you can use anywhere in your Vue application, and it's reactive. And this object will be used by router view to display the page itself. Now, we have the router in between these, right? So we know that the router is going to communicate with the URL somehow, because we can also update that. And we know that the router is providing this data for us, which works very well for Vue, because we keep this data-driven UI development that is really enjoyable with Vue. And this is great, but at the same time, it's also a problem sometimes, because we forget that there is quite some complexity behind it, and there are some limitations that we have to deal with that are related to the browser. At the end of the day, the URL that you have, when you think about it, is different depending on the platform, the operating system, the browser, and its version. But we're still manipulating with JavaScript, whereas everything else in an application, we are the one building it. So we are the one responsible to ensure that it works the same across every single application. Going back to this object, it's nice because it goes well with the Vue philosophy, right? But because we forget that behind there are other things, other questions may arise. For example, we may think, why page is a string? If it's clearly a number, why do I have a string there? These param objects here, it's empty. Can I not pass some state inside so I can have extra state passed during the navigation? What about changing the URL but keeping the same view? What about changing the view but keeping the same URL, even though we decided that a path corresponds to a specific component? So as myself, a user, I find this sometimes frustrating, because I want to use these features, and I realize that they don't really go well with the philosophy of the router, and it goes sometimes even against how you create apps with Vue. The thing is, I'm both persons, right? I'm the user and the maintainer. So as a maintainer, I think that I have something that is flexible, that I can use in many different use cases. And it's true, it works with a lot of use cases. But we forget how far the router concerns the code of the application. It touches a very, very large surface of the application, and this is not easy to deal with. So as a maintainer, I see my own use case, and I think, is this really necessary? Is this really what everybody's going to find out? Fortunately, we have other when I say always contributors, but people who are going to report the same use case and saying, oh, it would be nice to have this feature. And other people are going to chime in and also say, oh, it would be nice to have this feature because I have it this other way. And this helps me a lot because I have my own use case, which is not enough to decide on a feature on an API, but I have other people deciding. It's not always that great. Oh, sorry. I forgot to remove that part. So I have to get back to that. As myself, I get back to this situation where I think my library is good. Now I have the use cases, so I realize, but people cannot use it. So there must be something wrong with the API. So I get this conflict inside me. I don't have two chihuahuas in my head fighting for each other, but you get the point. So that's why today I want to talk to you about how do we get the most out of Vue-Router. So I want to go and dive a little bit in some of the technical specific details, the implementation details that we have behind the router, talk about some of the APIs we used, and how you can leverage them to do stuff that is not always aligned with the Vue-Router, but that are actually use cases that you may need. So some of those cases are dynamic routing, Twitter-like models, which is basically changing the URL without changing the view, and URL encoding. The first one, dynamic routing, is, as its core, being able to add and remove routes after the router has been created. So while the router is running, while your application is running, you want to be able to add and remove routes. The API doesn't have to be exactly this, but the fact is that the current Vue-Router version can only add routes. We cannot remove routes. And the reason for that is because there are some problems about the order. So if you create a router with these two routes, the first route is a dynamic parameter called ID. And the second one is a static route, about. The thing is, the second route is never going to get displayed because the first route also works out for the second one. So the router is going to test them in order. And to go there, we have to talk about what is inside. So what happens before the router gives the information to Vue. And the first thing we have to talk about, I mean, not the first thing we have to talk about, but the first thing that comes into mind is the history, which you can control, by the way, using the mode. You have a string, mode history, hash, abstract, etc. But there are other things that are hidden from the user that you cannot even control. For example, the matcher. The matcher is private API. You don't get to use it directly, but it plays a crucial role on how this dynamic routing is going to work. And of course, we also have the components that you also use directly. So to talk about dynamic routing, I want to talk first about this, the matcher. The matcher is responsible for transforming a string that comes from the URL into this object that you get as a user. So you have the path, the params, the name of the route if it has any, etc. It is able to extract the useful information like the ID of this URL and gives you an object that is easy to use. But that's not it. It's also able to do the opposite. It takes the name of the route, some object of params, and generates a URL, a string version that can be used to put into the URL. The truth is, this is actually the same operation. This is just normalization of a route inside the router. And the way it works is by transforming the path that you provide when you're adding routes into some regex. Of course, it's not the only way to make it work, but that's how it works in Vue-Router. And it's how most routers do. So for example, you have home. You want to create a regex that just matches the string home. Also some slashes that has to be escaped because it's also used for the regex. For the ID, you see that there is a capturing group that catches anything but a slash. And then you can customize the regex. So that's the last example there. So for example, you want only numbers. You can provide these parameters. And it will customize the regex used when we transform the path. And last, if we add another route, it's going to come after that. So for example, movies new will only be that. Now, because the order matters, the matcher is going to test them. If we are on movies new, for example, we're going to see, OK, let's see if the first one matches. It doesn't match. Let's move on to the next one. And the next one is going to match. But because it's going to match, it's going to stop there. And we're never going to get to that last one that we also wanted to match. And that also works. And we're never going to display the path we wanted because, well, the matcher stopped before. So if we want to change these, we could change the order they are tested. And the way we can do that is by providing some kind of score, some ranking that says this route is worth X points. The more points you have, the higher you are on the list, and the higher it is tested. The earlier it is tested. So for example, if we inverse the order by using a score, movies new will be tested first. So it will work out perfectly because movies ID is right after. How does this work? It works by splitting up the URL, or rather the path, into different sections. A section is just the fragment that is divided, by a slash. So for example, home, that's one section. It's a static section, so that's 70 points. Then if we go to movies new, that's two sections, so we have 70 points 2 times, 140. And then if we go to something like a dynamic param, we want to give that less points so it doesn't appear before. So we have 60 plus 70. And then if we add a custom regex, we want to give an extra, a bonus, 5 points to make it appear before the more generic one. So at the end, this is how dynamic routing is going to work. It's not exactly the way it works in Vue-Router because we also have subsections, so it gets more complicated. And because it's private, it can also change in the future, which is a great thing at the end because it means that you don't need to even care about it to benefit from it. You could use that try tree is the opposite. But thanks to this, now we can have dynamic routing. And if you're interested in dynamic routing, if you think you need it for your application, please come give some feedback on the RFC we have open. It has been open for some time now. There are many other functions related to the API. Maybe you have some use case that we haven't think about, so please come by. So we have the matcher. That's great. Now, if we want to talk about the Twitter models, we have to talk about the history because we need to know how it works a little bit behind the scenes if we want to use the API ourselves to get out of that model, one URL equals one component. The history can be changed with this string version on the current version of the router. On the next version, it will be a bit different. You could pass an instance that is created with a function. So Vue-Router will expose some of these functions, but ideally, you will be able to create your own versions. So this has 2 advantages. First is that now it's tree shakeable, which means that your application will only contain the history module that you used, and it's also allow custom history implementations. Behind that, what we have is the history API, which probably you have seen at least somewhere on the internet, maybe not because you didn't need to use it. And you have a few functions and a few pieces of state. The first are these 2 functions here. So you have push state and replace state, which are basically very similar to push and replace from the router. They share the same signature, so you have data, which is going to be the state you want to assign to an entry on the history. Then you have title, which is not used, basically. So it's like male nipples. All these years have passed with the API, and we still don't know if it was a mistake. And then you have the URL, which is basically what you want to display on the browser. Last but not least, we have the event pop state, which allows you to react when the user clicks back or forward. And we have the state. The state needs a bit more explication, so we're going to go through an example for that. So imagine we go to movies.com. We arrive there. If we check on the console, history, the state, and history, the length, we're going to get null and 1 because we only have one entry on the history. Then we can push state to say, OK, I want to push this state. We pass an empty string because it doesn't matter. And then we pass the URL. So that's going to change the URL. It's going to change the state. And it's going to increment the length. Then we can push again. It's going to change the URL, change the state, and it's going to increment the length again. Now, if we go back, we're going to change the URL, change the state, but the length of the history stays the same because we still have the same amount of entries. And we can replace entries in the middle and stuff like that. We can replace the state. We can do a lot of useful things where in between. And then we can, of course, push forward. It's going to change again the URL, the state, and keep the same length of the history. Now, the idea for Vue-Router-Next is for people to be able to provide a custom history, especially in cases like mobile integrations with native script or other things. However, there is still no interface, so to say. There is no specific API we want to complain to. and there is no RFC for it. So if you're interested in working into these, please come see me. I think probably people from NativeScript will want to participate in that. We still don't know however, how we go from this object to this other object. There is a lot of things going on. We know how the params are populated, but what about the rest? So to do that, we need to talk about the URL. Now, the URL, we don't need to care about the domain because we cannot change it with JavaScript. That would be very easy for phishing if we could. So we only have the path, the query, also named search, and the hash, also referred as fragment on the specification. So these three variables are accessible through the global object location, which is going to complete the API with the history. So the path is accessible on path name, the query is accessible on search, and the hash is accessible on hash. And the whole thing is accessible on href. Fun fact, in some older versions, you will get different unencoded, decoded versions on the different variables. It's not the case anymore. That's great. You don't have to worry about that. But it was a bit of a pain sometimes before. So it's very easy to transfer that path and that hash, but what about the query? If you have used these options on Vue-Router, you may know that we have a parse query and a stringify query that allows you to go both ways between the string version and the object version. And you also may know that there is an API on browser that is called URLSEARCHPARAMS, which is very cool, very simple to use. You create this object, and you can iterate over the keys. It uses modern JavaScript. It's great, except that we have our friends here, Internet Explorer and Safari. So Internet Explorer doesn't support it at all because it gave up life already. It knows it's going to die. So Safari, on its side, it has bugs. I think it was a specific bug of encoding spaces that it shouldn't encode. The truth is, if you want to use them, you have to use a polyfill. So instead, what everybody does, they build their own library, pretty much like web components. Nobody uses them because you need a polyfill, so you build your own library, and here we are, right? So what we do with URLSearchParams is just not use it at all. We just build our own version. And Vue-Router has its own very small version, but it allows you to plug in your own version that may be more complicated and, of course, more heavier. So we know how we go from this URL into the object, but there are a few questions left. What happens with the text that we can put on the URL? The truth is we are quite limited in terms of what can be used on the URL, and we might not be always aware. So you probably have seen, at least if you have visited Wikipedia once and one article, that you have these percentage 20 on the URL. What does that mean? That percentage 20 that you see is encoding. It's URL encoding, also known as percentage encoding. Now, the rules behind it are not that complicated, but I think that because if you want to know the whole thing, you have to read the specification, not the whole specification, which is 15,000 words, which is like 60 book page. It's a lot. But you have to read all of the parts, and because it's a specification, it's basically a state machine. David K-Piano will be happy about that. But you have to understand the state machine, read the state machine paper to understand what is available and what not. So here are some basic rules, and you're going to see that it's not that complicated, and this is important if you have any character that is not ASCII, basically, because there is not a single language that only uses ASCII characters. I think there was one, but I'm not sure what it was used, because even in English you have borrowed words from other languages. So imagine you have the double quote there. The hexadecimal value for that character is 22. If you want to encode it, that's percentage 22. The same happens for the lesser than sign. It's 3C, then it goes percentage 3C. For anything beyond ASCII, though, it's a bit different, and I'm not going to go into the details. I don't remember them, but it has to deal with UTF-8 lower bounds and stuff like that, so not that sexy as a topic, and definitely very hard to understand sometimes. So even though it's F1, it becomes C3B1. So as you can imagine, if you have, for example, Korean, Chinese, you're going to end up with URLs that are completely unreadable, complete garbage on the URL. And for the end user, this is very complicated because they don't really understand what it means. For example, if you want to write this HTML tag p class A on the URL, it becomes this, which I'm not going to even read because it's unreadable. So what are the rules? The rules can be condensed into these. We have anything that is non-printable, so that goes from the character null to the unit separator. It's not the US, it's United States, it's unit separator. And the delete character, you have to encode it with the percentage. Anything that is non-ASCII, so anything beyond that point, which is anything after the tilde, which doesn't have to be encoded, has to be encoded as well. And of course, the percentage character itself, because we need to use it for the encoding, has to be encoded. But that's not it. We have a few more rules, depending on which part of the URL you want to deal with. The easiest one is the hash, because it's at the end. So you have only the space. That's the small line like that. Then you have the double quotes, the lesser than, bigger than signs, and the backtick. The path also has all those characters, and on top of that, we have the hash, because it appears later on the URL, interrogation mark, the same reasons, and curly braces, I don't know why, but they're probably reserved for something. The query, interestingly, is almost the same as hash, except that we don't have the backtick, and instead we have the hash, because it appears later, the ampersand, and the equal, because you use them during the query. Now, this is all theory, is nice, but what about the practice? Okay, we know that we are developers, so we like to shit on browsers, right? So let's do a test and see how they handle this. We are setting the location.hash using the console on different browsers. It's the same as using push state in terms of results, just in case you were wondering. And we're setting the hash to all the characters that should not be used, okay, and see how they behave. Safari is gonna give you back, so this is if you read again the variable after setting it, it's gonna give you back the same value. Fine. Then on the URL, for some reason, you have the %20 appearing. So this is weird because it means that for the developer, you're giving the wrong version, and for the user, you're also giving the wrong version. The user wants to see something readable, but here they have %20, which doesn't make any sense. Then we have Firefox, which is doing great because it's giving the developer the encoded version, but then on the URL is giving you the unencoded version. So the user gets to see something that makes sense, while the developer is able to get something that is PEG compliant. Chrome is doing great, gives you also the hash on the right encoded hash version, and then on the URL, for some reason, it encodes some stuff and other things not. That's fine, I think. And then we have Internet Explorer, which doesn't do anything at all, as you can expect. So it just gives you the same value in both places. And here comes the fun. If we use the encoded version, so that would be the right version of the string, and we put it into the hash. Safari is going to give you the encoded version of the hash, which is great. And on the URL is going to give you the encoded version as well. But think about this. On the other version, we had also the %20. So what is funny is that depending on how you enter the URL, you're going to get a different result on your JavaScript, which doesn't make any sense. And I think it's probably a bug, but I'm waiting for it to get fixed. Firefox, on the other hand, is going to give you the encoded version. That's normal. That's by the way, that's the actual value that results when you call the function encode URI. And then the URL is going to be the unencoded version, which is perfect because it means that both ways are consistent. And this is protecting the developer mostly, but it's really great. Chrome is going to do the same thing, so it's going to stay consistent. It's not going to do anything weird, but it's going to stay consistent. And Internet Explorer doesn't do anything, so just give you the same value. Which, hey, at least it works. You're getting the right value, but you have to make sure that you call the right encoding functions behind. So Safari is questionable behavior because it's basically a bug. Firefox is perfect because you have the best of both worlds. You have the readable version for the end user and the correct version for the developer. Chrome is great, I guess, and Internet Explorer is dying anyway. So it's important to know that these are the versions that we want, right? Most importantly, is not about having a decoded version of the URL, but rather having a consistent version when we set things that are not correct on the hash. I also choose the hash because it was the most bug-prone one, I have to say that. But I have other funny bugs. So for example, Internet Explorer, if you put, I mean, it's not a bug, but, well, I mean, at this point. If you put a path that is unencoded on the URL, I think you also did with the queries, it's going to send to the server the encoded version, but it's going to give you the uncoded version on JavaScript. It's really amazing. So what do you retain from this when you use Vue-Router? When you use Vue-Router, you have different ways of pushing. So if you push using a string, so that means that both the path with the object or the plain string version, if you use that, you could write it this way. You could also write it these two different ways, with the encoded version, or using a name and then passing an ID for the param or whatever else you want. Never do the two first, OK? The two first are wrong, because when you pass the string version, Vue-Router is not going to do any encoding for you. The idea is, if you want to override some of the default behavior or anything, so we don't want to control that part there. However, if you use, well, the string version that is encoded, that's fine. I personally don't see myself calling encode. Personally, first, I don't see myself knowing by heart every single thing I need to know, and encoding every single parameter I know. But the last version is the best one because it does everything for you. So you provide the unencoded version to the router, and the router is going to encode those values for you the way they should be. So depending if it's the query, the hash, or the path is going to use the right encoding tables. That works on different browsers. So we come all the way back here. I have an extra arrow there. So we have all these modules that are different. And the reason I'm showing this is because, is because this is pretty much the architecture of the new router. And I think this is important. It's one of the parts I've been spending most of my time doing some research on other browsers, many browsers, on other routers, trying out ideas. And so these different sections of the router, except for the components, of course, which are very specific to Vue, are their own different modules. It means that the matcher and the history could be completely abstracted as different packages. They are part of Vue-Router, but they could be used for any other router if we wanted to, because they are not coupled to the router, which means that the responsibilities of the different sections of the router are very clear. And if you want to contribute, you're probably going to have a better time than before, which wasn't always the best, I have to say. So what is coming to Vue-Router-Next? We have all the things I've talked about. Dynamic routing is there. It's something that already exists. Custom history, we need to get the right interface, the right API, and agree on that first, but it's possible based on how it is working right now. We have better encoding defaults. Now, most of the time, it won't affect you, because I don't know why, but most people I work with seem to use English URLs, but there is no real language. There is no language where you're not going to use any accent somewhere. And also your user could end up putting a character somewhere and breaking the router. I mean, it won't break the router because we catch the errors, of course. But it's good to know that sometimes the behavior is not consistent, as I showed you before, with the different browsers based on an encoded or decoded version. And you should always try to use the encoded versions because those are the right ones. So if you go through the router, you're sure that you're going to have the encoded versions. Otherwise, it's a bug on the router, of course. We have composition API, as you can imagine. So that means that we have pretty much used links, so you can have the same functionalities you have on the router link, but as a composition function. The guards, although they are not all implemented, and maybe other things yet to come. We have navigation direction. This is new. There are a few small things that I'm not going to add here, but you can know if the user clicked on the back button or the forward button. There are very specific cases where it's impossible to know based on the information that the API gives you, but we cannot do much on that. I mean, we do give you the information that we don't know, but at least we know that we don't know. We have also forcing navigations. This is something new that we can do. We have better TypeScreen support, although TypeScreen support was already pretty good on Vue-Router. But this is also going to make the library easier to contribute. So I hope to see more people contributing to that. We're also opening to more per-case documentation. The Vue-Router being at the level it is, it's quite low level when you think about it. It doesn't give you that much. And things like Next really help to make that experience shine. And they rely on that lower level API. It doesn't mean you shouldn't use the Vue-Router directly, of course. But the idea is some of the things should be leveraged as plugins or things that you can opt in rather than always have inside. And as a result, we also have different sizes. So the old router, or rather the current router, is about 9 kilobytes minified, just zipped. The next router, even though it has more features, is under 7 kilobytes so far. We still have things to add, true, but this is also the version without tree shaking. This is the whole ESM module with everything. If we remove some libraries, it goes down. And this is not it. If we go a bit further, because everything is so modular, we could provide lean versions of the router. This is not something is implemented yet, but is possible. So we have, for example, a very simple matcher that only handles, doesn't handle subsections, for example. So most people do not need subsections. And it becomes, instead of being 2 kilobytes, it becomes 1 kilobyte. So the end result for the router is that we can go below 5 kilobytes quite easy. We have a lean build. Everything I've talked about, which is implemented, you can check it out on the repos of Vue-Router-Next. You can contribute as well. It should be a bit easier and more available as well to help if you want some guidance sometimes. There are to-dos around that you can search in the code to help. That's great. There is also a board where I try to put tickets of things I want to do, and some things are on hold, so you can pick those. And I want to finish by saying thank you to the sponsors who are helping me out to keep working on open source, also the Open Collective as well. But if you are one of the persons who are also sponsoring me, come say hi. It will make me happy. And I hope that you're as excited as I am for the next version of Vue-Router, and I can see you contributor in the future. Thank you.